First, I'd just like to ask Joseph Phillips, I'll ask you. How do you answer the argument that was made by, among others, General Norman Schwarzkopf in the amicus brief in the Michigan case, that the military needs, for reasons of morale and national security, it needs black and Hispanic officers, and to have an appropriate number of senior black and Hispanic officers, one of the tools is affirmative action. Is that a reason for which you would say, okay, I'd prefer that result than whatever other result might emerge from colorblindness in the process?
No, I would answer him with the words of Colin Powell, who, in talking about affirmative action, talked about colorblindness. And I can't remember the exact quote, but what Colin Powell says is that if you're talking about removing barriers, if you're talking about non-discrimination, so that then he's all for it, I'm all for it, everyone here is for it. If you're talking about putting people in places of over the not the ruling of men, but officers over groups of men who are not qualified, that is not what Colin Powell endorses, and I'm positive that that is not what Norman Schwarzkopf.
So in being selected for some program that might lead one to advancement, that selection process should be absolutely colorblind, not look to make sure you're sending up a couple of minority candidates up with a group, regardless of metrics.
No, of course not. I think that clearly undermines the confidence that you need to have in a fighting unit.
Okay. Tim Wise, I have a brief question for you. If race-conscious policies of the government have created the inequities that you've cited, and you feel that race-conscious policies are justified in redressing them, how far would you go? What about race-conscious tax policies? Why don't we have refundable tax credits for members of minorities, and you and I can pay the alternative male whiteness tax. We pay the AMWT, and that way we can go right to the end result of the unfair competition and redress it. Or do you draw the line at colorblindness?
No, I would look, the example you give I wouldn't endorse, but I would endorse the government of the United States and those corporations and their existing entities that stem from other entities in past generations that profited from and made possible the institutionalization of white privilege
why not an
and
extra
white
exemption
preference.
for
I would say I wouldn't
minority?
do it in tax policy. I believe, and we can come back and debate the issue of substantive repair and restoration and reparation some other time. We're not here to debate it tonight. I would support the government doing that. I'm not saying white folks should take out our checkbook and have a line item for black people, but I would suggest that the government, which made possible the institutionalization of this systemic inequality, has an obligation to rectify it by many means, of which affirmative action is one. It's not the only one, and it may very well not be the best one, but it's one, and it's the one we're here to discuss tonight, and to get rid of it won't bring us to any of the other possibly better options that we could discuss at a later time.
More discussion to come. Thank you, Tim. Terence Pell, the motion says it's time to end affirmative action. That leaves open at least the possibility for people on your side that there was a time when it wasn't time to end affirmative action. Was there a period when confronted with many American institutions that were overtly segregationist, that excluded people, was there a time when it was appropriate to have affirmative action, or would you say never? No, this is for Terence Pell.
Clearly, institutions that operated completely segregated systems had to do something more than remove the fact of segregation itself. They had to take affirmative steps to break down the barriers that they themselves had created. That was the original idea of affirmative action, and it made sense then. But since then, it's grown into the systematic use of preferences all over the place, and that's just a completely different
But you're describing
use.
places of de facto segregation. If there was a very small population of minorities, there would be a case there for...
No, I'm talking about particular institutions.
Only
for
particular
example,
institutional
yes,
segregated
to remedy
institutions.
their own discrimination.
Otherwise, there's never been a case for affirmative action.
That's what I think. That's right.
Okay. And Kim Crenshaw, I have a question for you, which is, if it makes good sense to admit a minority applicant to law school for good reason, even though that candidate's test scores and grades would not qualify for admission if it were a white applicant, does it equally make sense at the bar exam, where there's a great disparity in success, to say let's have a lower grade for passing for minority candidates? It's different. We see a racial disparity. Why not? What's the difference between that and qualifying with grades?
Well, I think there's a case to be made that all standardized tests are deeply problematic, and there's plenty of cognitive social science to suggest that. So if we're asking about whether there are alternative ways to measure merit, if there are alternative ways to measure the predictability of success, I'm all for it. The main point of this argument, however, is whether we should eliminate affirmative action in the admissions of in colleges and law schools. And the reality is,
Tim Wise said he's not limiting himself to those subjects. Yes.
The reality is that what the other side will refuse to tell you is that those tests do not tell you anything about the success of minority students and lawyers in the profession. President Bach, President Bowman, guys who were president of Harvard and Princeton proved that the level of success for people who are admitted through affirmative action to higher education and law school in particular are as successful, if not more.
But just define the contours of the argument, my bar exam question. That's different?
I'm not saying it's different. I'm saying that the proposal that you're asking right now is whether we should eliminate affirmative action. If we want to talk about other ways to minimize the discrepancies and to minimize the other kinds of discriminatory effects on other standardized tests, I'm all for us talking about that.
We're going to try something different. I'd like to ask each of our panelists to pose a question to someone on the opposing side. Joseph Phillips, first. You're in favor of the motion. A question from you for Tim Wise, who's against it. And you'll have about 1 minute to answer that question, or you'll have exactly 1 minute to answer that question.
Make the actor go first. I'm going to be protesting outside of here. I have two questions.
Well, let's have one question. It's hard enough to answer
I'm
one
trying
question
to choose
in 60
which
seconds.
one. Well, I'll ask this one. I'd like to know, I listened to Tim's speech, and I thought and wanted to know, why is it that that blacks, or that youth seem to think that blacks can only achieve when the playing field is level?
Well, I don't say that black folks can only achieve when the playing field is level. I'm making a moral argument that the playing field should be level, because for it not to be is an injustice. I'm talking about it from an ethical perspective. I happen to think Madam C.J. Walker was the first black millionaire, and she made it in 1911 when 67 black folks got lynched. But I don't think we would say, well, hey, if Madam C.J. could make it, all y'all could have made it. Because she was selling beauty products to black women that white folks didn't want to make. Good for her. But no one in their right mind would have said, see, everybody should go out there and work. So I think folks can succeed. The question is, what are our obligations as a society to create a level playing field? It has nothing to do with what the outcome can or cannot be. It has to do with what is right and what is just and what is proper. And I would guess, just a guess, that when people have equal opportunity, they are indeed more likely to succeed. I'm pretty willing to stand on that this evening.
And Tim Wise, opponent of the resolution, it's time to end affirmative action. Why don't you pose a question to John McWhorter, who supports that motion?
Sure thing. John, you suggest that people of color are potentially less qualified, as evidenced by their college performance, maybe should go to less selective schools as a result. So given that, what should we conclude, the people in the audience and those of us up here, from the data which suggests that men, on average, also receive far lower college grades than women of all races and ethnicities? Does that mean that men are unqualified for the slots that they receive in colleges and law schools, and that maybe they should lower their sights to second and third tier schools and leave the best slots and opportunities for all the women? And if it doesn't mean that, why doesn't it mean that, given your argument about race?
John McWhorter, your answer.
Tim, I'm not sure that you're aware of the degree of the discrepancies that I'm talking about. I mean, we've long known about those particular gender discrepancies, and if we're going to talk about a kind of mindless bean counting, then no, I'm not in favor of that kind of address of racial preferences. But when you're dealing with schools which, before a ban on preferences, have a stark two-tiered system where black students are crashing and burning at much vaster rates, then I think that in terms of arguing about morality and how we address the past and how we help people cope with a nation where I don't think that the playing field could ever possibly be perfectly level, that there is an issue for talking about racial preferences rather than what you're talking about.